So the point is, we'll see going forward. My own opinion is, looking at the long sweep of things, that this is a really long run problem now we're facing. This is not just an ordinary problem. In other words, what's happened here to the engine is that the balance sheet has been pushed to a point where it is exhausted, and we don't know how to resuscitate it. Does everybody understand what I mean? In other words, how are we going to get these assets up and the liquidity up and the net worth up without people borrowing? I mean, how is this balance sheet going to, how are we going to, get it back to where it was? Where are we going to inherit all this money from?
We can save more?
Well, we can save more, but you understand that's slow. That's slow. And so my fear is, and remember, I'm wrong 8 or 9 times a day, unless you ask Mrs. Professor, in which case we're up to double digits. So, okay. But my fear is that we're going to pull out of this situation very slowly. In other words, we've really run the horse into exhaustion here, and it's a problem. But you don't have to take my word for it. What you guys can do is keep track of the data yourself. And if you see a lot of, who knows? I could be completely wrong. But are there any questions? Yes, Mike.
What would be the first indicator you would be looking at to see that there would be?
Okay. One of the best indicators, I don't see how any, and this is, and in a way this is ironic, but I don't see how we can go forward, given all the institutional settings we have, without that private borrowing recovering. As Dave said in the beginning, it's the federal borrowing which is compensating for the private. In other words, it's the federal borrowing and spending which has to compensate for the lack of private. Now, that can't go on forever, for reasons we could discuss, all kinds of political and practical reasons. So the private sector has to recover. And one sign, ironically, one sign of the balance sheet recovering would be the ability to borrow again. So I would say the private borrowing has to recover. And then, of course, looking at something we haven't looked at today, to my mind, the one thing that could be done that's most important that's not being done is stopping the foreclosures. It's a real foreclosure crisis. And it's not being done. You've got to stop the foreclosures. Why? Because the foreclosures are driving the price of real estate down. And if the price of real estate keeps falling, and I'm not a realtor, but it seems to me if the price of real estate keeps falling, it inhibits builders from building. It inhibits people from buying. I mean, okay. The trouble with the foreclosures is it puts more and more homes out there on the market, right? They're for sale. So it creates the problem. In other words, let's put it this way. Let's say we were dealing with strawberries, and there's a glut of strawberries on the market. Well, the strawberries are highly perishable. The stores have a big sale, they cut the price of strawberries, they can move a lot of them, and what they can't move, spoil, and they get thrown out. And tomorrow's another day. But not with the homes. The homes sit there. And so you've got to stop the foreclosure. In other words, it seems to me one way to put an artificial price under it, to stop it, from going down further, would be to have a general cram down of the outstanding mortgages. In other words, the house was $500, the mortgage was $500,000. Now the house is 300,000. Well, you got to get that mortgage down to 300,000. Well, one way, of course, would be just to cram it down till it got there. But then, of course, the lender is hurt. Well, then the federal government would have to save the lender harmless. In other words, make up the difference. Well, that's a big program, and there's a lot of folks resisting it. Even the banks themselves don't like that kind of a program because it creates the precedent of cramming down the loans and so on. My understanding is that was the kind of program that was done during the Great Depression, where loans were written down and the lenders were saved. But we're not doing that. I mean, President Obama has has a program, but it has to do with reducing interest rates on outstanding loans, not writing down the value of the debt. And I'm afraid as the home prices fall and more homes are underwater, that is, the price of the home is less than the outstanding mortgage, it creates incentive for people to default. People say, well, why should I keep on paying on this thing? It's crazy. I should stop paying and then walk away from it. It raises those kinds of questions. And so I'm giving you a much longer answer than you probably wanted, but I would be more aggressive in stopping the foreclosures. So I would say when the foreclosures start coming to an end, then we might see some light. That's another, it would be a good sign. So some of these things have to, and I know people are saying, well, we're seeing some signs of recovery, but what they're really saying is we're seeing signs that the declines are stabilizing. In other words, it's not falling as rapidly. As Mr. Summers put it, remember Larry Summers, of course, the head of the President's Economic Council, he said, well, we had the feeling that the ball had just rolled off the edge of the table and was falling, and now it's stopped falling. That doesn't mean it's going to bounce high again. It may hit with a thud, And so, yeah, Mike, you had a question.
Yeah, it was about what you previously said about getting people to borrow and lend.
Yeah.
To me, it seems like we have nothing left to drive our economy. Like in the last 7, 8, whatever, 9 years, we had a debt bubble, and that was kind of artificial because it wasn't based on real wealth creation. But I think we've outsourced so much of our production overseas. To me, the key to getting people to borrow and lend and give people more middle class incomes, and that would involve bringing production back to America, because I think it's been happening throughout the century, but a lot of that has been covered up by the cheap and easy credit. So it kept people spending. They took out the equity in their home, they went into debt more, and they spent, which kept the economy going. But now that the curtain's been pulled open on that, so I think the real issue, the underlying issue, is to bring back more of our economy to America in order to give people more spending power, more borrowing power. Because the banks, if you give them, let's say, infuse them with $1 trillion, I don't know if they're going to want to lend to anybody, because if they're afraid that people are going to not pay the loan, they're not going to make money. So what's the point of lending? Hear like politicians say we got to get banks to lend, but you can't make people lend or borrow. It's such a climate that everyone's kind of scared.
It's a real problem. It is. And the thing is, see, it's not a disaster like 1932. See, it's not, in my view, it's not going to be a Great Depression. 1929, 1930, 1931, 1932, nothing was done except maybe the wrong stuff was done. So by the time FDR came into office, in March of '33, when he took office, it was a disaster. It was collapse. 25% unemployment. It was a disaster. Well, what's happening now, we're doing stuff right now, and therefore we're not going to have that kind of collapse. The federal government is borrowing and spending, and we're trying to do things, and so, but that doesn't mean that things will get robust again soon. See, there's a difference between avoiding collapse and restoring robustness.